I solemnly swear that I am up to no good. Hey, everybody, and welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. I'm Alistair Stevens. Tonight, in the third session of our third season, we are going to discuss chapters 5 and 6 of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, in which Harry finally arrives at Hogwarts, but not before running afoul of the Azkaban guards, the notorious and fearsome Dementors. Welcome everyone who is hanging out here tonight. It's going to be a great chat. You guys are already blowing up the YouTube chat. It is wonderful too to welcome Lynn and Aidan and Dealey, who are all first timers joining us here live. Welcome, you guys. It is great to have you with us. Good luck trying to keep up with the chat. It's a chatty bunch here for Dear Mr. Potter. You can, of course, contribute to the discussion live in the YouTube chat, or you can contribute via Twitter using the hashtag Dear Mr. Potter, or you can email me, as many of you have this week. I think I've received more Dear Mr. Potter email in the last week than I have any week previously that I've been running this show, which is wonderful. You guys are, as ever, smart and insightful. You can email pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. A couple of quick announcements before we begin. First, and perhaps most urgently, I should say that there is, as I speak, a hell of a storm raging over Oklahoma City, and I'm a little nervous about the reliability of my internet connection and, you know, what do they call it, electricity. If the worst should happen and the power should go out, then we'll just call it quits for tonight, and I'll cover whatever extra material I had next week. We'll wrap that up in our discussion of chapters 7 and 8 of Prisoner of Azkaban, which we'll get to next week. Hopefully we won't have any problem. Hopefully we'll be just fine, but just in case, if I should suddenly disappear from your screen, that's what's happened. There has been some kind of vengeful thunder god has stricken me, has smoten me, and knocked me right off of the internet. But I'm hopeful that we'll be able to run for the full 90 minutes. Second, registration is now open for a really exciting new class that I'm running in the first week of September through Point North Media. Breaking the Frame, Understanding the Visual Art of TV and Film. It's a class about cinematic literacy, about visual literacy, about understanding shot composition and shot selection and editing and lighting and focus and depth of field and all the many myriad techniques used by our favorite directors and cinematographers to tell stories in visual media. It is going to be really interesting. I've never taught a class like this before, but I cannot wait to get into it. It is going to be a fascinating discussion. So if you are in any way interested in the kind of critical analysis of TV and film, obviously here at Point North, I tend to focus on the story. That's what I do. But in the same way as novelists rely on the written word, directors and the makers of TV and film rely on shot composition, rely on editing, rely on this kind of visual language that I'm going to introduce you to in the span of this 2-hour class. You can find out more by heading on over to pointnorthmedia.com and clicking the classes button right at the top. And don't wait, because there's an early bird discount for registering now. It's going to be a really fun class. If you're at all interested in cinema and TV, go check that out. I cannot wait for it. Let's get into then our discussion tonight. I have to say, first off, that chapter 5 is perhaps my favorite chapter in Prisoner of Azkaban, is almost certainly my favorite chapter that we've had from J.K. Rowling so far. I think that this is truly and genuinely masterful. I think that the introduction of Professor Lupin, the introduction of some long-running plots with Scabbers and Crookshanks, obviously the introduction of the Dementors, and of course the final arrival at Hogwarts, I think that J.K. Rowling has perhaps never been more skillful than she is in this chapter. This is a real sign of things to come from the Harry Potter series, and I just can't wait to discuss it. So there's going to be a real bias in our discussion tonight toward chapter 5 rather than chapter 6, because chapter 6 goes a long way to kind of reseating us in Hogwarts, kind of addressing Harry's experience of coming home and feeling more settled and more secure. So we get a number of kind of somewhat disassociated, fragmentary scenes just anchoring us once more in the world of Hogwarts. Now that we've spent the first 5 chapters of the book elsewhere, we kind of refamiliarize ourselves with our surroundings. So we're not going to spend too much time in chapter 6, but we are going to move through chapter 5 with some care and attention to detail. And we begin with there's a lot of love for Lupin here in the chat tonight, which I have to say, I completely understand, but steady on. If we're going to talk about our favorite professors of all time, I would like to go to bat for Minerva McGonagall, and we're going to see why in tonight's reading. Minerva McGonagall, pretty great. That's an A-grade professor right there, but obviously I share your love of Lupin. I should say, too, that I have with me tonight just a a little snifter of red wine here, and just in case we should need it later, I do have some chocolate. So if you're in any way troubled by the Dementors, let me know, and I don't know, digitally send you some chocolate. We can do something in the YouTube chat. I'm sure it'll be fine. It'll be fun, you guys. All right, let's get into our discussion and our departure from the leaky cauldron. This is our first slide of the evening. They headed down to breakfast, where Mr. Weasley was reading the front page of the Daily Prophet with a furrowed brow, and Mrs. Weasley was telling Hermione and Ginny about a love potion she'd made as a young girl. All three of them were rather giggly. "What were you saying?" Ron asked Harry as they sat down. "Later," Harry muttered as Percy stormed in. Harry had no chance to speak to Ron or Hermione in the chaos of leaving. They were too busy heaving all their trunks down the leaky cauldron's narrow staircase and piling them up near the door with Hedwig and Hermes, Percy's screech owl, perched on top in their cages. A small wickerwork basket stood beside the heap of trunks, spitting loudly. "It's all right, Crookshanks," Hermione cooed through the wickerwork. "I'll let you out on the train." "You won't," snapped Ron. "What about poor Scabbers, eh?" He pointed at his chest, where a large lump indicated that Scabbers was curled up in his pocket. Mr. Weasley, who had been outside waiting for the ministry cars, stuck his head inside. "They're here," he said. "Harry, come on." Mr. Weasley marched Harry across the short stretch of pavement toward the first of two old-fashioned dark green cars, each of which was driven by a furtive-looking wizard wearing a suit of emerald velvet. "In you get, Harry," said Mr. Weasley, glancing up and down the crowded street. Little discussion of Percy already in the chat. Percy Weasley is a fascinating character. We're going to see, we have already seen, in fact, in the page preceding this one, that Percy is constantly the butt of the joke. We've already seen that in this book. We've seen that in previous books. Hey, good news, you guys. It's going to continue until it takes a tragic turn later in the series. Percy is unlike any of the other Weasleys. And what I was thinking about today, as I was considering the enigmatic Percy Weasley, was simply this. Why is Percy Weasley a Gryffindor? Why is Percy Weasley, who is possessed of no virtue greater than ambition, not a Slytherin? Under any other circumstances, it may well be argued that Percy is the poster child for House Slytherin. And yet here he is, a Gryffindor like the other Weasleys. It's unfortunate that he is the butt of the joke. It's unfortunate that Arthur even gets in on the comedy, that Arthur kind of leans into and enjoys somewhat Fred and George's relentless teasing of their elder brother. And Percy is certainly pompous. Certainly Percy is, wow, he's tremendously arrogant. As Rahit says here in the YouTube chat, because he wanted to be a Gryffindor, it's entirely possible. As we know, J.K. Rowling is going to kind of retcon the rules around the sorting hat a little later in the series. Angela says he has the Weasley heart of courage. Well, yes, certainly. But is courage more a Percy Weasley trait than ambition? I mean, he has the devotion to his studies that Hermione has. Certainly Hermione and Percy bond very early in the series and will be bonded until such time as they are suddenly and pretty irrevocably not anymore. But Percy doesn't have Hermione's love of knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Percy doesn't have that thing which distinguishes Hermione's underlying and fundamental Ravenclaw nature. But we accept that Hermione was sorted into Gryffindor because she is a secondary protagonist. Is Percy a secondary protagonist? Does Percy have that spark of not bravery, though we're told over and over that Gryffindors are brave above all other things? Does Percy have that spark of heroism? I mean, we'll see how he acts and how he behaves much, much later in the series. But at this point, certainly throughout his school career, it does seem as though he's defined primarily by that ambition. It's another odd little point. The YouTube chat is really moving. Aiden says, yeah, I think he wanted to be like Bill and Charlie, which I think is completely fair. Percy Weasley has classic middle child syndrome, right? He is absolutely an overachiever, but he is also somewhat isolated. Like, he has withdrawn himself from his family, almost, you get the sense, defined himself in opposition to his family. He doesn't share anyone's interests. There's no one in the family like Percy. I mean, arguably the closest person would be Ginny, and there's a huge gap there. So Percy is trying to define his own identity. Certainly, Percy seems to want to do good. His role as prefect, his role as head boy, his role ultimately with the Ministry of Magic will be a role of service, will be a role intended to better his community. but it's still a role that is defined by advancement. It's still a role in which he takes a great deal of pride. And if he has a secondary trait under ambition, it seems pretty clear that it is pride. Yeah. Allison says in the YouTube chat, I think Percy is sorted into Gryffindor at least partially because it underlies Ron's desire to break out from his family like no one else does. I think that's really interesting. Yes, we will definitely see kind of a reflective symmetry between Percy and Ron as we move through the series. I think that's a really good catch. Yeah. And yes, yes. Rohit says, does he want to do good? I've always thought he was in it for his own ambition. Certainly ambition. Yes, he wants to be recognized. He wants to be celebrated, but he does seem to be genuinely dedicated to helping, at first Hogwarts and then the Ministry of Magic. These are service roles, right? A job with the Ministry of Magic is not necessarily the most glamorous job that you can get. It is in the public eye, and it speaks to his sense of ambition and may well speak to some, unresolved issues regarding his father, which kind of speaks to that middle child syndrome again. But it does seem as though he's positively influencing his community around him. And I think that would be a really useful and valuable kind of exemplar for House Slytherin as we move into the back 2/3 of the series, as we shed some of our naive ideas regarding, the houses of Hogwarts and the sorting process itself, and we move into more sophisticated territory. Percy could have been a great exemplar of that, though, of course, if Percy's Slytherin in the first book, we immediately don't trust him. He's immediately a bad guy. Rahit is asking what is meant by middle child syndrome. Basically, Percy has a difficult role in the Weasley family. He's not the eldest boy. He's not even the second eldest boy. He's the third eldest. And then beneath him, we have Fred and George, and we have Ron, and we have Ginny. And that means that he never got the attention. He's not, the eldest and most responsible son. He's not even, the greatest accomplishment at this point, but he's also not the baby of the family. Ron and Ginny kind of co-own that space, I guess, and Bill and Charlie kind of have the older sibling bracket locked off, and Fred and George are, a unique force unto themselves. So Percy's left without a kind of clearly established role in the family dynamic. And historically, psychologically, I admit, reductively, horribly reductively, it is said of middle children that they seek to simultaneously withdraw from the family context and define themselves in opposition to the family context. Middle children are oftentimes the outliers. Middle children will seek to find their own path. And Percy certainly doesn't share a lot in common with the other Weasleys. Elizabeth is prompting me here to take down the slide, but I can't take down the slide because we have things to discuss, even though I've just spent 5 minutes talking about Percy Weasley. Let's take a look then at the slide. This is one of the things that I love about the opening of this chapter. We are no longer deep in Harry's POV. You'll remember that we concluded chapter 4 very tight on Harry's experience. He's giving us this very direct account, and our exposure to the entire wizarding world through Harry's perspective is intimate. It is entirely colored by his own experience. But now we've stepped back. Now J.K. Rowling has done that thing that she does so beautifully and is giving us a more omniscient kind of third-person perspective on what is going on. They headed down to breakfast where Mr. Weasley was reading the front page of the Daily Prophet with a furrowed brow. Mrs. Weasley was telling Hermione and Ginny about a love potion she'd made as a young girl. All three of them were rather giggly. Rather giggly is a great phrase there. I absolutely love the use of that phrase to indicate a kind of familial playfulness. Hermione is absolutely a part of the family, which I just adore. But look at Arthur here, just from what we get in the slide. And we're going to repeat this in the next slide too. He's reading the front page of the Daily Prophet with a furrowed brow. Well, we know what he's reading about, right? Then, after breakfast, Mr. Weasley, who had been outside waiting for the ministry cars, stuck his head inside. "They're here," he said. "Harry, come on." Go and look at Arthur Weasley's dialogue in Chamber of Secrets. Go and look at Arthur Weasley's dialogue even earlier in this book. This is positively terse. This does not sound like Arthur. Arthur is a genial, affable, friendly fellow. But not now, not here. He is under a great deal of stress. And what J.K. Rowling is doing beautifully throughout this opening passage is showing rather than telling. We don't know. We are not told explicitly what it is that is weighing on Arthur Weasley's mind, but we know. We know what it is. So we get the furrowed brow. He's waiting outside for the ministry cars. "In you get, Harry," said Mr. Weasley, glancing up and down the crowded street. He's uncomfortable, he's nervous, he's anxious, and he is, of course, protecting Harry. It's really beautifully done. Yeah, as Aiden says in the YouTube chat, he's like, we need to go now. And Tony's virtual journeys says, I hate walking into a room of giggly girls, instantly feel insecure. It's a really beautiful kind of portrayal of intimacy, right? And even then, Arthur is on the outside of it. He's reading the paper with a furrowed brow. Mrs. Weasley's doing what she does, which is creating family. She is just automatically generating family around her. Whatever magical spark there is of hearth and home, Molly Weasley carries it in her heart and shares it generously. It's just a great moment. And we're going to continue this dynamic as we move forward through the chapter here. Let's take a look at our second slide, where, as I say, this continues. Mr. Weasley kept close to Harry's elbow all the way into the station. Right then, he said, glancing around them. Let's do this in pairs, as there are so many of us. I'll go through first with Harry. Mr. Weasley strolled toward the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, pushing Harry's trolley and apparently very interested in the Intercity 125 that had just arrived at platform 9. With a meaningful look at Harry, he leaned casually against the barrier. Harry imitated him. In a moment, they had fallen sideways through the solid metal onto platform 9 3/4 and looked up to see the Hogwarts Express, a scarlet steam engine puffing smoke over a platform packed with witches and wizards seeing their children onto the train. Percy and Ginny suddenly appeared behind Harry. They were panting and had apparently taken the barrier at a run. "Oh, there's Penelope," said Percy, smoothing his hair and going pink again. Ginny caught Harry's eye, and they both turned away to hide their laughter as Percy strode over to a girl with long, curly hair, walking with his chest thrown out so she couldn't miss his shiny badge. Once again, Mr. Weasley kept close to Harry's elbow all the way into the station. This is to suggest, by the way, that we are still anchored in Harry's POV, because we're not calling them Arthur and Molly. We're calling them Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. And that is because we are still in Harry's POV and more broadly in a juvenile POV. They are still parents. They don't have first names yet. I mean, clearly, canonically, they do have first names yet. We've used them already, but we're not referring to them by their first names because they are still parental figures, and that's important. Let's do this in pairs as there are so many of us. I'll go through first with Harry. We had no hint, no suggestion at all that the passage onto platform 9 3/4 was in any way vulnerable. There's no suggestion of that in the first two books. Harry's kind of conscious of it. Harry's mindful of it, but the existence of every other witch and wizard in the world suggests that Harry is looking at it from a Muggle perspective rather than from the wizarding perspective. It's fascinating that Arthur takes Harry with him, not one of his, blood children, his effectively, foster child at this point. He protects Harry first. And they do this nonchalant slide through into platform 9 3/4 before Percy and Ginny break through behind them. And then, of course, we get this beautiful moment between Ginny and Harry. I am, as you know, kind of Team Ginny. I kind of adore Ginny, and I love these moments of intimacy. Ginny blushing and turning pink and murmuring hello when she meets Harry again after the long summer break. That's one thing, but Ginny is going to stand out throughout this chapter, albeit stand out, very quietly, a long way in the periphery. She's not going to be the focus of our attention very often, but when she is, she's going to shine. So we have this moment of genuine intimacy between Ginny and Harry over, of course, a dopey love affair. Over, of course, this little romantic tryst that's going on between Percy and Penelope. So there's a nice association there. We're getting a further development in the story. It's pretty good. It's pretty good, you guys. So we're on platform 9 3/4 safely, but we're building this sense of tension. We're building this ongoing kind of sense of oppression. But notice what J.K. Rowling's perspective, her skill here does. We're not embedded in Harry's POV, so we're not getting his discomfort, but we're enough in his POV that we know that he is aware of everything that is going on. He is the lens through which we note Arthur reading the paper with a furrowed brow, Arthur ducking in from outside saying the ministry cars are there, Arthur glancing up and down the street, Arthur, staying right close to Harry's elbow and leading him onto platform 9 3/4. We're getting this sense that something isn't right, that something really is threatening us now. And of course, all of this is calling back to the overheard conversation, and we're about to get kind of a partial recapitulation of that. But it's building this sense of danger, the sense of doom, even as we're once again undergoing a now familiar threshold transfer into the wizarding world again. Now we're leaving mundane London behind, but note that we're doing it in cars belonging to the Ministry of Magic, driven by wizards wearing emerald green suits. We're in the magical world. And again, we're seeing that distinction in books 3 between the sequestered, wizarding world that we saw in the first 2 books, and now the sequestered Muggle world, this kind of isolated and alien Muggle world that we're getting in book 3, indicative, of course, of the evolution of Harry's experience, the ongoing, passage into adolescence and his reframing of his own experience and the world in general, but also, of course, indicative of the shift in tone of these books and Rowling's kind of developing interest in the wizarding world rather than the Muggle world. The wizarding world is no longer an escape from the Muggle world, and the Muggle world was never an escape from the wizarding world. Harry doesn't have an escape now. He doesn't have a place to go, and that's all part of that flourishing sense of adolescence. As I catch up with the YouTube chat here, Aiden, this is interesting. I hadn't made this connection, but I think you're absolutely right, Aiden. Aiden says, everything about the Ministry in books 2 and 3 is green. When Harry sees Fudge in book 2, he's wearing green also. That's excellent. Yes, I hadn't caught that. That's very, very good. Good. All right, let's move on to our next slide with, of course, a word from the Weasleys. A word and a hug, I should say. Mrs. Weasley kissed all her children, then Hermione, and finally Harry. He was embarrassed, but really quite pleased when she gave him an extra hug. Do take care, won't you, Harry? She said as she straightened up, her eyes oddly bright. Then she opened her enormous handbag and said, I've made you all sandwiches. Here you are, Ron. No, they're not corned beef. Fred, where's Fred? Here you are, dear. Harry, said Mr. Weasley quietly, come over here a moment. He jerked his head toward a pillar, and Harry followed him behind it, leaving the others crowded around Mrs. Weasley. I've got to tell you before you leave, said Mr. Weasley in a tense voice. It's all right, Mr. Weasley, said Harry. I already know. You know? How could you know? I heard you and Mrs. Weasley talking last night. I couldn't help hearing, Harry added quickly. Sorry. It's not the way I'd have chosen for you to find out, said Mr. Weasley, looking anxious. Once again, we get this tension, anxiety, his clipped and terse, by the standards of Arthur Weasley, his clipped and terse dialogue here. The stress is really getting to him. And when the stress gets to a Weasley, you know that things are very bad indeed. But I want to talk first. God, I want to talk first about Mrs. Weasley. I want to talk about Molly because she's just the greatest. Rob says in the YouTube chat, I find it interesting how Harry and Hermione are still separate from all her children in spite of how she's been acting. This, I think, is a beautiful observation, Rob, and it's in direct opposition to the actual semantic content of the scene, right? The semantic content of the paragraph. Mrs. Weasley kissed all her children, then Hermione, and finally Harry. Well, she's kissing her biological children, and then Hermione, and finally Harry. Action counts for more than words. We judge people by their actions. And Molly here is clearly including Hermione and Harry in her extended family. I've made you all sandwiches. She's not talking to, Ron and Percy and Fred and George and Ginny. She's talking to all of the children. This is what makes Molly so powerful. She's such a powerful symbol of home, of family, of unconditional love. And we see that from Harry's POV in the second sentence there. He was embarrassed, but really quite pleased when she gave him an extra hug. When was the last time that Harry was hugged by a parental figure? Because there's a pretty good chance that prior to Molly Weasley, it was never. There's a pretty decent chance that it was never in his conscious life. But now he has found a home. Now he has identified himself with a family. He has been identified with a family, by that family, which is a very powerful thing. He has been accepted. It's beautiful. Tess observes gorgeously, and in fact, let me get to Stephanie first. Stephanie says, I love that Harry confesses. It shows how he has so much respect and care for Arthur, which is a beautiful observation, I think exactly on the money. And Tess says, Harry is trying to be kind to Mr. Weasley and take the stress away from him, even though Arthur is trying to protect Harry. And then, of course, Dylan points out, got a feel for Arthur. He just found out that his fight with Molly was so loud it was overheard by the kids and may have hurt Harry and the others. That's a really good observation too, I think. Yeah, absolutely. There's a great sense here in which Harry is aware of the stakes of his current conflict. He's aware that he is in danger. He's not stupid. He's noting these elements as we move forward. But we're not getting a response to those elements. We don't get Arthur Weasley glancing around nervously and Harry kind of swallowing his own discomfort or, feeling a prickle on the back of his neck. We're not getting any emotional content from Harry at all, but that doesn't mean that emotional content isn't present. Our narrative perspective is just that step more distant from Harry, that its absence doesn't necessarily indicate an absolute emotional absence. Its absence from the narrative doesn't mean that Harry isn't feeling anything. And we must remember that really weird scene at the end of the previous chapter where he asserts out loud, "I'm not going to be murdered." And we talked a little last time about whether or not that is Harry being certain about his place in the world and exhibiting a great kind of, a Persian level of confidence and almost borderline arrogance. He's been through all that he's been through. Hey, he's not worried. I'm not going to be murdered. I'm fine. Or, much more convincingly to my mind, it is Harry trying to reassure himself. Hell, it's the start of another school year, and once again, I find myself way over my head. It's possible. Tolkien Lover is joining us here in the YouTube chat. Great to have you with us, Tolkien Lover. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Jordan says, and I find myself in rapt agreement here, I would love to see more Molly Hermione scenes. Excuse me. They seem to have a connection too that I'd love to understand. I want more Molly and Hermione and more Hermione and Ginny. I have to say, I love those relationships. Yeah. Great. So let's move on to our next slide. Oh, before we get to that, I guess we should note, because it's going to, come back around as these things so often do. We should note that Arthur warns Harry not to go looking for Sirius Black. It's not stay out of trouble. It's not watch your back. It's not be safe, even though that's what Harry expects him to say. It's don't go looking for Sirius Black, which is, on the one hand, a really skillful kind of introduction of some subtlety and some complexity and some real depth to Harry's relationship with Sirius, which, of course, we'll get to much later in the story. But it's more than that. It is, for me, a moment of recognition of Harry's special status. Hogwarts is in trouble. Hogwarts is besieged, effectively. It is besieged by the most dangerous prisoner, the most dangerous criminal ever held in Azkaban. And now it's literally besieged / guarded by the Azkaban guards, who we haven't met yet, and will probably turn out to be fine and fluffy and really nothing that we have to worry about at all. But this is a very different tone from anything that we've seen previously. Hogwarts is besieged. And Arthur recognizes, I think, that if there's trouble at Hogwarts, Harry is going to find his way into it. He is going to take action. And partly that's textual. He is the boy who lived. He is the boy who dealt with the Philosopher's Stone in the first book and dealt with the Chamber of Secrets in the second book and saved Ginny in the second book. May we remember, because it's going to be significant in just a few pages' time. Harry is kind of the hero of the school, so it might be expected, textually speaking, within the fictional frame of Rowling's creation here, that he takes some action, that he get involved. So we've got kind of foreshadowing of the personal relationship between Harry and Sirius. We've got this kind of recognition textually of Harry's special role. And we have this metatextual knowledge that the book is called Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. It's not the case that the Dementors are going to take care of Sirius Black, or that Dumbledore is going to take care of Sirius Black, or that Harry is just going to really buckle down and study hard this year and get an A in divination and just kind of, not get involved in any extracurricular activities. So we get these three layers all kind of intermingling, and then it's so forceful and so beautifully done that we call back to it just a few pages later in a beat that is simultaneously comedic. I find it enormously charming, but also kind of chilling and kind of disquieting. We'll get to that on the very next slide. But first, hey, there's probably a character that we should introduce, right? I don't know if you guys have any strong feelings at all about Professor Lupin, but here he is. For my money, by the way, one of the great character introductions that we get in Harry Potter. Harry, Ron, and Hermione set off down the corridor, looking for an empty compartment, but all were full except for the one at the very end of the train. This had only one occupant, a man sitting fast asleep next to the window. Harry, Ron, and Hermione checked on the threshold. The Hogwarts Express was usually reserved for students, and they had never seen an adult there before, except for the witch who pushed the food cart. The stranger was wearing an extremely shabby set of wizard's robes that had been darned in several places. He looked ill and exhausted. Though quite young, his light brown hair was flecked with grey. "Who do you reckon he is?" Ron hissed as they sat down and slid the door shut, taking the seats furthest away from the window. "Professor R.J. Lupin," whispered Hermione at once. "How do you know that?" "It's on his case," she replied, pointing at the luggage rack over the man's head, where there was a small, battered case held together with a large quantity of neatly knotted string. The name Professor R.J. Lupin was stamped across one corner in peeling letters. This is just a fantastic character introduction. And of course, we might speculate, those of us who have read this book before and know a little more about Professor R.J. Lupin's real nature, we might speculate why he is looking so ill and exhausted. He's probably been going through quite a lot recently. It's a beautiful, beautiful introduction, though not without its curiosities, I suppose. The Hogwarts Express is completely packed. There are no seats to be found, or at least not 3 seats together to be found anywhere on the train until the very last compartment. That seems surprising considering how uncrowded the Hogwarts Express has appeared in previous years. Are we supposed to believe now that there's just a huge influx of first years to Hogwarts? Can that account for the differing numbers given about the population, the resident pupil population of Hogwarts at any given time? It is possible, at least. But it's also worth noting that Harry, Ron, and Hermione are sitting in a carriage right at the very end of the train. And later, when a certain attack is taking place, we'll be told that people are running to and fro outside of the carriage. But where are those people running from and to? Where are they going to outside of the very last compartment on the entire train? There are a couple of things in this chapter that have that kind of odd, almost careless spirit to them, right? That seems like a continuity error. They're sitting in the very last compartment, and yet people are running back and forth outside the door. Well, are those people just running to like the end of the hallway, the 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet to the end of the hallway and then back? Are they, deranged? It's possible considering what's happening at the time. But then we also get this weird time jump. Right before the Dementor attack, the train starts to slow down, and Hermione notes, well, we can't. Ron, excited that they're about to get to Hogsmeade and excited because he really wants his feast, starts getting ready to leave. He's good. This is it. He's happy. We're here. And Hermione says, well, we can't possibly be there yet. She looks at her watch. We can't possibly be there yet. And then after the Dementor attack, we're told that we're going to reach Hogsmeade in 10 minutes, which is perhaps possible, right? It is perhaps possible that the Hogwarts Express is magically the most punctual train in history. But even then, 10 minutes, it doesn't feel as though Hermione is justified in saying, well, we can't possibly be there yet. I mean, it's possible that she is very certain about the Hogwarts Express schedule, but it's also possible that there's a certain malleability to time, that there's a certain strangeness to time and space on this train. And of course, in that slide that we just discussed, we have this beat of Harry, Ron, and Hermione literally pausing on the threshold. They're literally pausing on the threshold to the compartment, but they are also here paused within the threshold. We talked way back in the first book, and then again in our discussion of Chamber of Secrets, about the ways in which the Hogwarts Express exists as a liminal space, as an extended kind of contiguous liminal space. It isn't in the Muggle world, but it also isn't completely in the Wizarding world. It's passing through the Muggle world. So while socially and aesthetically and even magically we might be in the Wizarding world, we're not there yet. And of course, the Dementors strike against the train, the Dementor attack on the train, and perhaps that's, inflammatory language. Perhaps I shouldn't be saying strike and attack. I should be saying, investigation of the Dementor sojourn on the Hogwarts Express. But that doesn't feel quite powerful enough. The Dementor attack on the train literally pauses the train again in this liminal space. We're held between. We're not home yet. So there's a lot going on within that idea, and the idea that threshold spaces are fluid, that threshold spaces are unpredictable, that they kind of simultaneously obey their own laws, their own rules, and then, of course, no rules at all. It's possible. Alison points out, we lost some time from Harry passing out, so there's a possibility that he was out for a good while. There is, but it feels as though Harry is not out for long. Certainly, we're still reacting to the attack when Harry comes to. I don't get the sense that he's out for an hour. I don't get the sense that he's out for half an hour. If I had to pin it down, I would say he's probably out for a couple minutes, no more than that. Yeah. Um, Okay, good. Oh, let me see here. There was an interesting thought that just passed by here. Oh, Stephanie, this is great. Yeah, Stephanie says the time element kind of reminds me how time works in the Polar Express. Time is always something magical. That's a good pull. I like that a lot. Yes. And Prisoner AB234 says, though it's strange how we never touch on that with Lupin again. I think we're talking about class his shabby clothing. Yes. It's strange how we never touch on that with Lupin again, reclass and money, when it's such a major plot point for the Malfoys versus the Weasleys. Yes, yes. Lupin is an interesting character. I almost feel I'm very skeptical about this kind of interpretation generally, because this kind of autobiographical criticism tends to devalue the text in front of us and overemphasize, overvalue rampant speculation about the creative process of the author. But there are points in this book when it feels as though J.K. Rowling wrote in strict linear order. We discussed this last week. Throughout chapters 3 and 4, we're referring to the Azkaban guards. And this, of course, is building off of book 2, where Hagrid is sent to Azkaban. And it is clear that J.K. Rowling didn't know at that point what Azkaban was. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that Azkaban at that point was not yet what it would become by the time that we reached the third book in the series. And throughout the third and fourth chapters, we're talking about Azkaban guards. And then we're introduced to the Dementors. And no one ever mentions Azkaban guards again. They're just, from that point on, Dementors, which is a much better name and a much more mellifluous and evocative and emotionally reactive word. Much more emotionally reactive title for these beings, for these spectral phantasms than Azkaban guards. So it almost feels as though she hadn't quite got there yet. And there is a sense of that with Professor Lupin too. He's here in so many ways, and yet he's not quite here yet. We're going to track this actually when we circle back around to Lupin in a couple of chapters' time, but next week's reading, in fact. But we'll have more opportunity then. Yeah. Okay. Let's keep moving on here now that we've introduced ourselves to Professor Lupin, and pick up on the back half of that point I was making earlier about Arthur. Harry explained all about Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's argument and the warning Mr. Weasley had just given him. When he'd finished, Ron looked thunderstruck, and Hermione had her hands over her mouth. She finally lowered them to say, "Sirius Black escaped to come after you. Oh, Harry, you'll have to be really, really careful. Don't go looking for trouble, Harry. I don't go looking for trouble," said Harry, nettled. "Trouble usually finds me." "How thick would Harry have to be to go looking for a nutter who wants to kill him?" said Ron, shakily. They were taking the news worse than Harry had expected. Both Ron and Hermione seemed to be much more frightened of Black than he was. "No one knows how he got out of Azkaban," said Ron uncomfortably. "No one's ever done it before. And he was a top security prisoner, too." Once again, don't go looking for trouble, Harry. Hermione, too, just like Arthur before her, recognizes, or kind of inadvertently, in Hermione's case, foreshadows the personal connection between Harry and Black, then recognizes his textual role of the hero of Hogwarts, and then the metatextual point that this book is called Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. And Harry responds to it. "I don't go looking for trouble," said Harry, nettled. "Trouble usually finds me." Which is kind of true. But it's also fair to say, I think, that Harry has looked for more than his fair share of trouble in, as Merging Puppy says in all caps in the YouTube chat, "Harry, you always go looking for trouble." Yes, it's absolutely fair, right? I mean, there are moments when he's pulled into this. There are moments when things happen. I'm thinking of him overhearing the basilisk, for example, in Chamber of Secrets. There are things out with his control, but he also considers himself the hero. I'm just fascinated by this moment of reflection here. It's certainly something that I want to pay attention to, because it echoes a little bit, I think, what I kind of accidentally alighted upon last week when we were talking about Harry's role as hero within the context of Hogwarts. There's a this sense that Harry is exceptional, this sense that Harry is special, this sense that Harry doesn't maybe always deserve the treatment that he gets, is given a little more license, is given a little more leeway, is recognized for his exceptionalism by the other students, which is a double-edged sword, and certainly by the staff and faculty of Hogwarts. there's a sense in which his celebrity is driving him forward in a way that his actions, while validating, are not entirely earning, right? That in a sense, Harry the boy is, throughout the first couple of books, and arguably throughout this book too, at least until the climax of this book, is constantly struggling to keep up with Harry the boy who lived. That's an important distinction, the man and the myth, the human being and the celebrity. There's a distinction there for Harry, and we're going to address that much later in the series when Harry wonders if that's part of it, if he has earned all that he has had, if he has really kind of if he is all that he seems to be by virtue of his accomplishment, by virtue of his virtue, as it were, or if he has kind of inherited the celebrity that he didn't really earn, and where exactly the dividing line between those two things are. And I think it's fascinating here to look at Harry's protagonism through that lens too. Harry is exceptional. We know this to be true. He's going to get caught up in this. We know that that's true too, but now we're having other characters lean on that. We're having other characters notice that. And that's creating a fascinating kind of reflexivity at the heart of the story. The story is beginning to comment upon itself, to talk about itself, to demonstrate self-awareness in a way that it hasn't previously. This is a great pull here from Rob. There's actually a bit of a parallel, Rob says, between Harry and Percy and how they have to live up to their roles. They're both driven, but taking it in totally different directions. Yes, I would say the distinction there is that Percy's goal is, is of his own making, is of his own desiring. He has decided that he wants this thing and he's working toward it. But you're right, there is a sense in which he's constantly kind of catching up with himself. Harry's role is not of his making. He was almost literally born into it. He was thrust into it, unwanted and without his foreknowledge. So there is a difference there, but I do think you're right. That's a very interesting pull. And of course, of our power trio here at the heart of the story, it's no coincidence that Harry is Slytherin. Harry is were it not for the existence of Protagonist House, Harry would probably make a very good Slytherin. He's got the capability. He's got a certain amount of ambition. He's got, God knows, charisma. He can lead. He can inspire. He is a hero, and heroes would belong in Slytherin House, if not for the existence of Gryffindor, if not for the existence of, as I dismissively refer to it sometimes, Protagonist House, which just makes me think of like Animal House, which I'm kind of into. Allison says, Harry has a savior complex that is wildly out of control sometimes. Yes, good. Okay. We're talking in the YouTube chat, we're comparing Hagrid with Bilbo. Don't get sidetracked now, but it's a brilliant thought. I love the... Bilbo is not the obvious point of comparison within the frame of the Lord of the Rings for Hagrid. I would argue, if I'm thinking about Hagrid, I'm actually immediately thinking of Beorn, right? I'm thinking of Beorn from The Hobbit. I'm thinking of the skin changer, the man bear on the eastern edge of the Misty Mountains, who kind of controls the wild and is connected to all of the animals of the wild. Though I think we might also argue that there's a little bit of a Tom Bombadil too to Hagrid. There's a little something there, and it's not at all inappropriate for us to talk about Tolkien within the frame of tonight's discussion of Harry Potter specifically, because we're going to talk about Dementors, and Dementors are, they're pretty Nazgul, you guys. I should say, I mentioned this in passing last week, and I actually got a couple of emails from you guys about this. It is said by J.K. Rowling and some of her, biographers, I suppose, by people who have written accounts of J.K. Rowling, that she had not read the work of J.R.R. Tolkien before she sat down to write The Lord of the Rings. Before she sat down to write The Lord of the Rings. Before she sat down to write Harry Potter, I should say. So many of the similarities between Tolkien's work and Rowling's work are... Well, see, here's the thing. I think it is stretching the point too far to say that those similarities are accidental, because you don't have to read Tolkien to be influenced by Tolkien. If you have picked up any work of fantasy published in the latter half of the 20th century, then you have been influenced by Tolkien, either in emulation through, the vast majority of fantasy writers, or in opposition through the works of writers like George R.R. Martin, for example. A lot of R's. for fantasy authors. I don't know if you guys have noticed that, but just a lot of R middle initials and initials of all sorts for fantasy authors. So while I completely accept, if J.K. Rowling tells me that she's never read The Lord of the Rings, I have no reason to disbelieve her. Like, I have no reason to think that, well, hey, it's obvious you've cribbed this element and that element, and you know, take it, Dumbledore is Gandalf and Hagrid kind of is Beorn, and you know, there are these similarities. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that it is much more likely that Rowling was influenced by the transformed landscape of modern fantasy that Tolkien left in his wake. She doesn't have to know about Nazgul in order to write Dementors. And, you know, despite some superficial similarities, they aren't really all that similar at all. And there are kind of better exemplars of the Dementor archetype in other stories that post-date Tolkien. So we can see kind of an evolution of that idea, but that perhaps is too large a topic for tonight's discussion. Aaron Phillips says it's easier to condense to Jar Jar Martin due to how it sounds if you say it fast. Jar Jar Martin is very good, actually. I think I have been inspired. I find myself doing this casually. I have been inspired by the Boars, Gore, and Swords Game of Thrones podcast, which I haven't listened to in a while because I've kind of fallen off Game of Thrones and I'm not up to date with it. But way back when they started the discussion of the first season of the TV show and then the first book, they took to calling him George Railroad Martin, which I just kind of like. There's a euphony there. There's a mellifluous quality to that I really quite enjoy. Yeah. Okay, let me see here. All right, let's keep moving on. Outlander Pam says on Twitter, heroes in Slytherin, what books are you reading? Well, here's the thing, right? To be a hero requires a certain kind of ambition. It requires a certain kind of positivity and confidence about your own role in the world. To be a hero requires that you believe yourself to be exceptional. You believe that you are more capable than the people around you. You believe that you are uniquely equipped to save the day, save the world, save the cheerleader, whatever it is that you choose to save. Or even if it's just to take positive action, just to help people around you, you have to believe that you are more equipped to do that than other people. And if, as I've said before, you know, if we had gone for a more traditional kind of, you know, id, ego, superego kind of balancing act here, if we'd gone for the logos, ethos, pathos arrangement, which we see replicated everywhere throughout Harry Potter, if that had been replicated in the house structure, then the houses would have been Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, and Slytherin. And Slytherin would have been possessed of a bright side, and characters like Harry, and ultimately, I guess, you know, characters like Neville, say, ultimately characters like Neville, and also characters like Draco Malfoy. Like those two houses are very much two sides of the same coin, because it is ludicrous to assert that Gryffindors don't have ambition. That for all of their bravery and their heroism and their love of glamour and their, you know, huge competitive natures, that they don't have ambition. They're not ruthless. Like J.K. Rowling did split when she forged this you know, four-part this four-part structure for the houses at Hogwarts. She did refine the idea a little further. But if Gryffindor didn't exist, if Protagonist House didn't exist, all the heroes would be in Slytherin. That's how that, I'm absolutely confident of that, you know. All the smart kids would be in Ravenclaw, all the, you know, good loyal kids would be in Hufflepuff, or if you like, all the intellectual kids would be in Ravenclaw, and all the emotional kids, and that's not to suggest that, this is not to use the word emotional here with any kind of disparagement implied or explicit here, right? But the intellectually biased children would be in Ravenclaw, the emotionally biased children would be in Hufflepuff, and the heroes, the ambitious kids, the kids who stand out, the kids who are outliers, the kids who are exceptional, are going to be in Slytherin. So that's kind of the way that I see that's logos, ethos, pathos, tripartite structure working when it's expanded out into this four-part house structure at Hogwarts. And of course, again, as I say every time we talk about the houses, J.K. Rowling is going to change her mind. She's going to develop this idea as we move on into the rest of the books and talk a little more freely about this. Question becomes, so Tess qualifies this: ruthless ambition versus heroic ambition. Very good. And QueenCon14 says, question becomes, what makes a hero? Motivation, action, the end result? Yes. Okay. Motivation, yes. The desire to take exceptional action defines, in part, within the frame of Harry Potter, a hero. If you step up, and we're going to see this later, of course, with the Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's army. We're going to get to this. If you step up, you are a hero. That seems to be pretty clearly a part of the kind of moral landscape of at least the latter half of the Harry Potter series. Action. Yes, action defines your heroism or your villainy. And it's not even action necessarily as much as it is ruthlessness. It is, what are you willing to not do? Where are you willing to draw the line? There's a reason, and we'll get to these in a few chapters' time, but there's a reason that we're going to put all of this emphasis on the 3 unforgivable curses, right? It's not that these are the 3 most powerful spells. It's not that these are the 3 most dangerous spells. It's that using these spells is an inherently evil act in and of itself. We're not doing a Tolkien-style, power corrupts parable here. It's not that. It's a simple moral choice. These things, doing these things, casting any one of these 3 curses is inherently evil. And if you don't draw that line, then you're a bad guy. That's it. We're done. And then consequence? No, consequence doesn't matter in the world of Harry Potter, right? The actual consequence of your actions is much less important than the motivation that inspired them, right? Because we have people doing bad things, or kind of, we have people doing well-intentioned things that turn out badly, and we never hold them responsible, right? Hagrid is a case in point here throughout the series, even before he is rendered completely insensible at the end. Yeah, good. Okay, this is a major sidetrack, you guys. I have a million slides to get to, so let's keep pushing on. I could literally talk about this all night, though. I find this stuff fascinating. Good. I'm up to date here in the YouTube chat. Oh, Nikki says, motivation and action. End result means the ends justify the means, which a hero does not make. That would make you Grindelwald. I think that's an interesting pull there, Nikki. I would actually move that kind of ends justify the means, though, into action. Like, are you willing to cross a line in the name of a greater good? Because if you are, then according to the moral landscape of Harry Potter, you are more likely to be a bad dude. Outside at least of the relatively harmless rule breaking that we get in the first 2 books, in the boarding school adventure story. Yeah. All right, let's move on here. Just so much going on. I love it. I love these conversations. Matthew says, I've always taken issue with the absolute morality implied by the unforgivable curses. Yes. Here's the thing. In a morally relative world, which up until that point, the world of Harry Potter seems to be, the unforgivable curses sit uncomfortably, because you're absolutely right. That is a moral event horizon. That is a hard line that we're drawing there. Ultimately, it feels to me as though the unforgivable curses are actually the kind of first introduction of a moral framework that will become more significant as we move forward through the books. But again, we'll get to all of that. You guys, we're gonna just do all the Harry Potter books. It's gonna be fine. Okay, let's keep going to, in fact, the Dementor attack. I can't believe we're almost an hour into this episode and we haven't discussed the Dementors yet. Here we go. There was a soft, crackling noise, and a shivering light filled the compartment. Professor Lupin appeared to be holding a handful of flames. They illuminated his tired, gray face, but his eyes looked alert and wary. "Stay where you are," he said in the same hoarse voice, and he got slowly to his feet with his handful of fire held out in front of him. But the door slid slowly open before Lupin could reach it. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the shivering flames in Lupin's hand, was a cloaked figure that towered to the ceiling. Its face was completely hidden beneath its hood. Harry's eyes darted downward, and what he saw made his stomach contract. There was a hand protruding from the cloak, and it was glistening, grayish, slimy-looking, and scabbed like something dead that had decayed in water. But it was visible only for a split second. As though the creature beneath the cloak sensed Harry's gaze, the hand was suddenly withdrawn into the folds of its black cloak. The repetition of cloak there in that last paragraph always stands out to me. As though the creature beneath the cloak sensed Harry's gaze, and the hand was suddenly withdrawn into the folds of its black cloak. It's weird because we're emphasizing the distinction between the creature and the cloak, and yet because we repeat the word cloak there in such close proximity, we're almost rendering the creature in terms of the cloak. It's a really interesting technique. Yeah, that description is enormously powerful. The hand protruding from the cloak, and it was glistening, grayish, slimy looking, and scabbed like something dead that had decayed in water. And then we get one of those rolling ellipses right there, right at the end of that paragraph, just holding us suspended. But it was visible only for a split second. It's a masterful control of pacing. Rob calls out here, I think it's thematic in the sense that the book is definitely about the fear of the unknown. The cloak just keeps it even more unknown. I like that a lot. We're sharing chocolate in the YouTube chat. That's so great. Yes. Let me know about your about the cards that you get in your chocolate frogs, okay? Yeah. Emerging Puppy says, at least there was no sniffing this time. That's true. That would be the only kind of Nazgul element that we could introduce to the Dementors to make them even worse, right? If they just sniffed everywhere, that would be pretty bad. They can sense rather than sniff. Michelle calls out a really interesting point here that I hadn't considered before, but this is going to haunt me now as I move through the rest of the book. She says, water reference, Slytherin-esque. And now I'm thinking, gosh, we really associate water with at the very least deception, right? We really associate water with trouble, with the alien, with the unknown, with the dangerous in Harry Potter. That's going to be a preoccupation that's going to keep me up nights through the rest of the series. Good catch. I like that a lot. Aaron's saying that he's got a slab of Honeydukes 80% dark with hazelnuts. That's very good. I skipped over the scene earlier where Ron is rhapsodizing about Hogsmeade, but it's a pretty good scene. Yeah, good. All right, so that's the first half there. Lupin gets to his feet. We see immediately how capable he is. They illuminated his tired gray face, but his eyes looked alert and wary. Stay where you are, he said in the same hoarse voice. He got slowly to his feet with his handful of fire held out in front of him. So strong. I love that. Let's push on to the resolution. An intense cold swept over them all. Harry felt his own breath catch in his chest. The cold went deeper than his skin. It was inside his chest. It was inside his very heart. Harry's eyes rolled up into his head. He couldn't see. He was drowning in cold. There was a rushing in his ears as though from water. He was being dragged downward, the roaring growing louder, and then from far away he heard screaming. Terrible, terrified, pleading screams. He wanted to help whoever it was. He tried to move his arms but couldn't. A thick white fog was swirling around him, inside him. Harry! Harry, are you all right? Someone was slapping his face. What? Harry opened his eyes. There were lanterns above him and the floor was shaking. The Hogwarts Express was moving again and the lights had come back on. He seemed to have slid out of his seat onto the floor. Ron and Hermione were kneeling next to him, and above them he could see Neville and Professor Lupin watching. Harry felt very sick. When he put up his hand to push his glasses back on, he felt cold sweat on his face. Yes, as we're calling out here in the YouTube chat, drowning, more water references. Yes, very good. Yeah. Excellent. So this is enormously powerful. Obviously, this is striking and arresting, and we get some more of that brilliant, J.K. Rowling pacing. Get that first paragraph, ellipsis, second paragraph, ellipsis, third paragraph, a midpoint ellipsis there, holding us still longer. He tried to move his arms but couldn't. Ellipsis. A thick white fog was swirling around him. Inside him, hard cut M dash. We pop right back out of it. So we're suspended and suspended and suspended, and then the release, when it comes, is immediate, is powerful. We are thrust firmly into Harry's experience. Though, of course, we're holding to Harry's, sensory experience here. We're cleaving very closely to it, which makes that first line very interesting. An intense cold swept over them all. Harry felt his own breath catch in his chest. The cold went deeper than his skin. It was inside his chest. It was inside his very heart. How do we know that the cold swept over them all? Because we are so deep in Harry's POV right now that we can't sense it. Except, of course, that this is metaphorically, emotionally true, right? From Harry's perspective, where he feels his breath catch in his chest, the cold went deeper than his skin. An intense cold, of course, swept over them all. It is all-inclusive, even as it is just affecting Harry. We're asking in the YouTube chat, I just lost the person who asked. Alan asks, so who was doing the slapping, Ron or Hermione? It seems as though the consensus in the YouTube chat is Ron, which I find interesting because I was certain that it was Hermione. That feels like such a Hermione thing to do. Harry, are you all right? That feels to me like Hermione more than Ron, I have to say. But hey, we don't know. Yes. Good. So then we get the explanation of the Dementors. Let's get through this. I don't get it. What happened? Said Harry, wiping more sweat off his face. Well, that thing, the Dementor, stood there and looked around. I mean, I think it did. I couldn't see its face. And you, I thought you were having a fit or something, said Ron, who still looked scared. You went sort of rigid and fell out of your seat and started twitching. And Professor Lupin stepped over you and walked toward the Dementor and pulled out his wand, said Hermione. And he said, none of us is hiding Sirius Black under our cloaks. Go! But the Dementor didn't move. So Lupin muttered something and a silvery thing shot out of his wand at it and it turned around and sort of glided away. It was horrible, said Neville in a higher voice than usual. Did you feel how cold it got when it came in? I felt weird, said Ron, shifting his shoulders uncomfortably, like I'd never be cheerful again. Ginny, who was huddled in her corner looking nearly as bad as Harry felt, gave a small sob. Hermione went over and put a comforting arm around her. But didn't any of you fall off of your seats? Said Harry awkwardly. No, said Ron, looking anxiously at Harry again. Ginny was shaking like mad, though. Harry didn't understand. He felt weak and shivery, as though he were recovering from a bad bout of flu. He also felt the beginnings of shame. Why had he gone to pieces like that when no one else had? Zygmorphix anticipates my move here, my interpretation here in the YouTube chat, and says, I always figured Ginny was remembering Tom Riddle. I have no doubt that that is the case. And we see why Ginny would be more gravely affected here by the intrusion of the Dementors than anyone but Harry himself. So it is a matter of public record so complete and absolute that it might as well be ubiquitous that the Dementors were inspired by J.K. Rowling's own experiences of depression prior to the publication of the first Harry Potter book. That is not, by the way, I see that reported all the time. That is the line, that is the description that is used, a bout of depression that she experienced prior to the publication of the first Harry Potter book, which has the unfortunate implication that somehow the publication of the first Harry Potter book magically cured J.K. Rowling's depression. Depression is a terrible thing, you guys. It is a neurological disease. It is an illness. It is something that needs to be treated with enormous kind of emotional respect and clinical respect. So I just want to, refuse to kind of even by implication validate that kind of magical thinking nonsense that gets you out of depression. That if you're depressed, you just need something good to happen in your life and then you'll be fine. That is dangerous and wildly untrue. So I just want to be very careful in my negotiation of that. But we can see, I think, within the Dementors and their kiss, literally, but within their presence and that spirit of hopelessness, we can see a powerful recognition and a powerful illustration of the influence of depression over the creative mind, over anyone's mind, honestly. I love that beat from Ron. I felt weird, like I'd never be cheerful again. And then on that ellipsis, we move our focus to Ginny, right? As Harry moves his focus to Ginny. And we know that Harry is moving his focus to Ginny because we get the comparison. Ginny, who was huddled in her corner looking nearly as bad as Harry felt, gave a small sob. Hermione went over and put a comforting arm around her. Well, in this moment, in this instance, Harry is the only one who knows how bad Harry feels. This is proof that once again, we've kind of settled back into his POV here. Aiden's calling out a great point. Hermione uses words like sort of and a silvery thing instead of finding out what it actually is. Seems like she would already know. I'm fascinated by this. Okay. Again, this is so commonly known that there's no conceivable way that this could be a spoiler here. Lupin uses the Patronus charm to dispel, to push away the Dementor. We're going to get deep into this later in the book, but it is fascinating that no one has a prior knowledge of this. And that is fascinating primarily because it doesn't just suggest that this is unusual, right? It doesn't just suggest that this is, well, We don't normally teach this to third-year students, thus, you guys have never heard of it. Hermione studies. Hermione reads every book that she can get her hands on. Hermione has studied the craft and the magic of the craft and the art, I should say, of magic assiduously now for at least 2 years, and we know, I think, a lot longer than 2 years. So she's focused on this stuff, and the Patronus is such an important representation of the fundamental narrative conflict, the fundamental moral conflict in this book and the series as a whole, that it is kind of unthinkable that Hermione wouldn't have come across it, unless it was now of more import than ever. We're going to look at this when we actually introduce the Patronus charm, but yeah. Good. Yes, let me see, as we're pulling back to a previous comment here, which I can't find, I'm afraid. Yes, okay. And the accompanying shame of things like mental illness calls out Aaron Phillips, which is a really great observation there, and was picked up. Gosh, the YouTube chat is just moving so quickly, you guys. This is crazy. That was picked up by. Nope, I can't find it. Never mind. It was picked up by someone who noted that Harry is beginning to feel shame right at the end of this passage here. And here's the thing about that. This is a beat that I do not like. I do not like the way that Harry passed out from the Dementors. I don't like the way the beat is used throughout the book. I don't like the way that it's turned into a joke. Admittedly, not a funny joke. Okay, we are not supposed to be laughing at this joke, but Draco Malfoy turns it into a joke. And that's not great. Like, just from the perspective of someone who is reading this book and trying to meaningfully engage with the kind of emotional landscape that it depicts, that's not great. So I'm not a fan of that beat, and I'm certainly not a fan of that beat with regard to the specific kind of diminution of the importance and the authenticity of Harry's emotional response to something that is deliberately and specifically analogous to depression. This is super important. And the joke of it, like, I completely buy Harry's internal shame. I get that, and I like that as something of a motivator for Harry that is oftentimes associated with depression and many, many issues surrounding mental health and mental illness, right? But I don't like the way that we even in passing play it as a joke. We'll talk more about that later when we get to it, I guess. Okay, let's keep pushing on, you guys, because we've still got, okay, it is 10 after 10. I think we're going to do 2 more slides, and then we're going to call it, and then we'll do 3 chapters next week. I think that's probably where we are. I should have known that I wouldn't get through 2 chapters this week because of the brilliance of Dementors. So let's do 2 more chapters, 2 more slides rather, and then we'll wrap up here at the end of chapter 5, and we'll do chapter 6, 7, and 8 next week, because honestly, I only have a couple of slides for chapter 6 anyway. This is our next slide. They didn't talk much during the remainder of the journey. At long last, the train stopped at Hogsmeade station, and there was a great scramble to get outside. Owls hooted, cats meowed, and Neville's pet toad croaked loudly from under his hat. It was freezing on the tiny platform. Rain was driving down in icy sheets. "First years this way!" called a familiar voice. Harry, Ron, and Hermione turned and saw the gigantic outline of Hagrid at the other end of the platform, beckoning the terrified-looking new students forward for their traditional journey across the lake. "All right, you 3!" Hagrid yelled over the heads of the crowd. They waved at him, but had no chance to speak to him because the mass of people around them was shunting them away along the platform. Harry, Ron, and Hermione followed the rest of the school along the platform and out onto a rough mud track, where at least 100 stagecoaches awaited the remaining students, each pulled, Harry could only assume, by an invisible horse, because when they climbed inside and shut the door, the coach set off all by itself, bumping and swaying in procession. The coach smelled faintly of mold and straw. Harry felt better since the chocolate, but still weak. Ron and Hermione kept looking at him sideways, as though frightened he might collapse again. Well, here we are. We have completed our transit. We have emerged from the liminal state of the Hogwarts Express, the doubly liminal state, the unusually liminal state of the Hogwarts Express and the Dementor attack, and now we're here. And look at the spirit, look at the energy that we're given as we arrive. They didn't talk much during the remainder of the journey. At long last, the train stopped at Hogsmeade Station. There was a great scramble to get outside. Semicolon, we are running these thoughts together because there was a great scramble. Owls hooted, cats meowed, Neville's pet toad croaked loudly from under his hat. It was freezing on the tiny platform. Rain was driving down in icy sheets. This is starkly experiential, right? We're getting this immediate rush of sensory information. It is crowded and it is packed and it is alive, and even the freezing rain, even this horrible, autumn in Scotland experience, this very authentic autumn in Scotland experience that Harry and the others are undergoing right now. All of this is just a rush of sense, right? We're getting this emotional immediacy from Harry and the others. Even the shouting of Hagrid, first year's this way, he's calling in. We're seeing him across the packed platform. Again, by the way, packed platform. We're really emphasizing how many students there are here. We're really emphasizing how many kind of resident pupils Hogwarts has at the moment. And I find that fascinating. Again, this maybe because there are just more first years this year because of, if you math it out, the consequence of, the last great disruption is just now kind of working through. And it is possible that for a while there, wizards weren't having kids in as great numbers. So it is possible that the population of Hogwarts was diminished for a few years and is now in an upswing again. Yeah. Maybe the train and Hogwarts really is a TARDIS, says Rob. A tiny platform for enough students to fill 100 carriages. 400 students, possibly. I mean, okay, let's assume that Harry, Ron, and Hermione are filling the carriage that they are in. That is literally 300 students, plus the first year intake, which who knows? Who knows? We're just, Oh, are we talking about Thestrals? We're talking about Thestrals. I've received a couple of emails about Thestrals this week. I don't want to talk too much about Thestrals because I know that there are some people who are reading along for the first time who have read Prisoner of Azkaban but haven't yet read the other books in the series. Trying to make sense of Thestrals is difficult because J.K. Rowling didn't plan them, basically. Thestrals are a retcon. They weren't supposed to be included. I'm absolutely certain that in exactly the same way as she didn't know what Azkaban was back in Chamber of Secrets, she doesn't know about Thestrals when she's writing Prisoner of Azkaban. So we get to them, yes. But it's tough. There are excuses. Oh gosh, there are just a lot of spoilers. Yes, at least 100. Aaron's pointing out, yes, at least 100 coaches. So there could be more, but we're talking about at least 300 kids in the other years of the school. Years 2 through 7. Yeah, good. Okay. Yes. Good. All right. That's excellent. I'm catching up here on some of the Thestral speculation here, but yes, there is an explanation for both of the incidents which ought to lead to Harry's exposure to Thestrals, but the real explanation is she hadn't thought of them. And when I say this, okay, I think I've made my point about this slide. Again, I want to reiterate in the most powerful terms, I do not judge J.K. Rowling harshly for evolving her narrative as she moves along, for adding these extra elements. The mythology of J.K. Rowling, not in the fictionalized sense, but rather the kind of the mythopoeic endeavor that has arisen around J.K. Rowling and the accounting of her writing these books, I think is probably a little harmful to our understanding of her creative process. I would love like a no holds barred, completely honest, like completely unglamorized account of the writing of these books, but that's impossible now because it was 20 years in the past and no one remembers things clearly in that sense. I love that she continues to evolve her work. I love that she evolves her understanding of the wizarding world. I love that she's not afraid of expanding the scope of that, of introducing new elements like Azkaban, like Dementors, like Thestrals. All of that stuff works really beautifully for me. So I'm not really that worried about it, honestly. This is not to judge the quality of the work here. It expands and enriches the writing, says Angela, and I completely agree. Yes, good. And Aaron says, didn't plan them. Yep, every time I reread the series, I find things to nitpick and then have to realize that the series grew as she wrote it. And thank goodness for that. I completely agree. Yeah. Excellent. All right. Let's wrap up then with our last slide of chapter 5 here, and I'll get out of here a little early tonight. Good. Professor Dumbledore, though very old, always gave an impression of great energy. He had several feet of long silver hair and beard, half-moon spectacles, and an extremely crooked nose. He was often described as the greatest wizard of the age, but that wasn't why Harry respected him. You couldn't help trusting Albus Dumbledore, and as Harry watched him beaming around at the students, he felt really calm for the first time since the Dementor had entered the train compartment. "Welcome," said Dumbledore, the candlelight shimmering on his beard. "Welcome to another year at Hogwarts. I have a few things to say to you all, and as one of them is very serious, I think it best to get it out of the way before you become befuddled by our excellent feast." Dumbledore cleared his throat and continued. "As you will all be aware, after their search of the Hogwarts Express, our school is presently playing host to some of the Dementors of Azkaban, who are here on Ministry of Magic business." He paused, and Harry remembered what Mr. Weasley had said about Dumbledore not being happy with the Dementors guarding the school. "They are stationed at every entrance to the grounds," Dumbledore continued, "and while they are with us, I must make it plain that nobody is to leave school without permission. Dementors are not to be fooled by tricks or disguises, or even invisibility cloaks," he added blandly, and Harry and Ron glanced at each other. "It is not in the nature of a Dementor to understand pleading or excuses. I therefore warn each and every one of you to give them no reason to harm you. I look to the prefects and our new head boy and girl to make sure that no student runs afoul of the Dementors," he said. Rob points out in the YouTube chat, "I noticed for the first time that Dumbledore has taken a very similar tonal shift to Mr. Weasley, all business now." Yes, absolutely, you're right. Or at least more business. He is, I suppose, still Dumbledorian, still, Dumblish. But you're right, he is. Michelle calls out the pun here that somehow I hadn't ever noticed. I have a few things to say to you all, and as one of them is very serious. Oof, okay, yes, I like that. That's pretty good. I will not be singing the Sorting Hat song, you guys. Maybe a little Patreon exclusive. Head on over to patreon.com/PointNorthRadio, and maybe I can be persuaded after more wine and more chocolate, let me tell you. Yes. This is brilliant. This is a great pull here from Dealey here. I like how he calls Harry out and the invisibility cloak, since it's most important that Harry listens. And the crucial kind of implication of that, Dealey, is that Harry listens. I often wondered about that first paragraph. Professor Dumbledore, though very old, always gave an impression of great energy. Several feet, we get the physical description. He was often described as the greatest wizard of the age. We're getting this kind of accounting. This is our biographical introduction to Albus Dumbledore, but that wasn't why Harry respected him. You couldn't help trusting Albus Dumbledore, and as Harry watched him beaming around at the students, he felt really calm for the first time since the Dementor had entered the train compartment. He is going to listen to Dumbledore because Dumbledore has earned his respect. This is a personal connection, right? Harry has had a healthy disregard for the rules of Hogwarts since he arrived, basically. And that's all well and good. As Alan says, Harry Potter. Yes, you can just imagine, Dumbledore giving the old stink eye to Harry and Ron at that moment. I like that very much. But what I love here is that by framing Harry's relationship with Dumbledore as a personal relationship, we are moving Harry on from that strict and rigid frame of authority that we discussed previously, that we discussed a little last week. Harry could push back against the rules of Hogwarts because the rules of Hogwarts were A, abstract, and B, kind of there to be broken, in the sense that all children rebel, in the sense that pushing back against authority is the duty of every child, particularly exceptional, heroic Gryffindor children. If you happen to follow that archetype all the way to its logical conclusion. But here we're drawing a personal connection between Harry and Dumbledore. Dumbledore is the greatest wizard of his age. Dude looks like Gandalf, but that's not why Harry trusts him. That's not why Harry respects him. And respect here is key. This is the first time, really, that we've seen a figure adopt an authority that is earned, that is not imbued, that is not, representative of a more abstract authority of that kind of legalistic structure that we associate at the grandest scale with people like Cornelius Fudge and organizations like the Ministry of Magic, and on the much smaller scale with people like Albus Dumbledore and the other professors of Hogwarts and the Hogwarts school itself. Harry is crossing that line now. Authority and respect and trust, these things aren't informed now by the structures that Harry has kind of absorbed osmotically, as we all absorb them osmotically, right? When you are a child, you obey your teachers, you obey adults, you obey your parents. As you mature, you aren't just permitted a little rebellion, a little, positive pressure back against that restriction. It's almost encouraged. It's a sign of a healthy adolescence. But then when you move through that, rebellion for rebellion's sake, you arrive at personal connections and you understand respect that has been earned, authority that has been earned. And Harry's connection with Dumbledore now isn't just narratively useful. It isn't just structurally useful in terms of the plot. That is to say, Harry's actually going to listen to Dumbledore and not immediately scamper off into the Forbidden Forest under his invisibility cloak, which God knows he would have done at any point in the last 2 years. Rather, he's going to move more carefully because of this legitimate respect. So there's that, but it's also a great sign of Harry's evolving maturity, of Harry's transit through adolescence. This is now not just abstract, not just obligatory, but personal, genuine, authentic. It's beautiful. And we know that this is important because of the careful way that the narrator calls it out. Here is Dumbledore, looks like Gandalf, greatest wizard of his age. That's not what matters. That's not what's important. That's not why Harry respects him. Harry specifically respects him. It's beautifully done. And of course, then getting the speech about the Dementors, we're getting again this. You're right. I think was it Rob who pulled that out? Was it Rob who? Yes, Rob called out the distinction there that Dumbledore 2 is more serious and more on edge. And again, this isn't accidental because the narrative calls it out explicitly. Harry remembers hearing Arthur Weasley talking about how uncomfortable Dumbledore was with the Dementors being around Hogwarts. So we know, because we're shining a light on that, we know that this is intentional and we know that it is significant. So again, we're getting that greater sense of oppression and of darkness and of course of limitation, of fallibility, because one of the things that happens as you transit through adolescence and you begin to see these all-powerful, omniscient authority figures as real, or wizards in this case, not just regular human beings, but superpowered human beings, but wizards nonetheless, you accept the limitations of their capability. Dumbledore doesn't want Dementors here, but he doesn't have a choice. It's a Ministry of Magic matter. Dumbledore doesn't want these children to be, endangered in this way. He doesn't want these children to be presumably scrutinized by Dementors on the Hogwarts Express, and yet they're going to be, because Dumbledore's power is limited. But in that limited power, as we'll see, we get the seed of, as I said earlier, the thematic conflict right at the heart of this book. We've already seen it. We don't know that we've seen it just yet, but we have already seen it. The thematic conflict at the heart of this book, hopelessness versus hope. It's the light that never goes out. It's wands up. It's the fundamental thematic construct at the heart of Harry Potter as a series. That's what it is about. That's what this entire story in its grandest sense is about. Hope versus hopelessness. And now we're doing it. And I'm very, very excited to get into our next chapter. That, I think, is going to do it, though, for tonight. There was definitely some discussion here about singing. I'm not going to go back and read that. I'm going to claim ignorance there and just not, put myself in a position where I end up singing on a YouTube stream. That seems like a terrible idea. Yes, good. That, I think, though, will do it. Becca Eller asks, can we just have news stories of all magical fictional children and their time at Hogwarts? Yes, I would love that, actually. I think that ultimately we may even get it. The shadow that Harry casts over the world of Harry Potter is, of course, long. He is the most significant figure in his universe, in his milieu. But that won't always be true. And it would be really interesting to pick up, not even with the next generation, but the generation after that. Or better yet, let's go back 4 generations, right? Let's talk about, I guess we're getting a little close to Fantastic Beasts there, which I found to be a fascinating and generally delightful movie, even if I didn't rate it as Harry Potter. I don't think I've talked about that on a Harry Potter stream before, but possibly I have. I don't know. Good. Angela says, is this why Harry doesn't forge the signature on his permission form? Yeah, there was some discussion of this on Twitter earlier in the week, and it is a little baffling, isn't it? Because Harry is not above breaking school rules, though there is an element of, this is what we're talking about earlier with motivation and action, right? Breaking a rule directly seems to be more acceptable. Sneaking out of the castle with the invisibility cloak, not so bad. Not so bad on the scale of things. You're breaking the spirit of the law, but not the letter of the law. Forgery seems to be a different thing. Forgery seems to be something a little more direct there. Yeah. Though we could certainly have motivated it through the plot in a different way. Yeah. As Rahit says, I think he respects Dumbledore too much to actively deceive him, right? That active deception is a different thing. Yes, that's good. That's good. Okay. Yes, Angela says, I wanted to bring it up because it was on Twitter and I was curious about it. Do check out the Dear Mr. Potter hashtag over on Twitter, though I will say that the most recent tweet as of this recording comes to us from Art K, who says, joke break, when is it appropriate to make a Harry Potter reference? Answer, always. That, I think, will probably do it for this week. I think we'll just let that heartbreaking, agonizing beat hang in the air there as we conclude. Guys, thank you all so much for hanging out with me tonight. Thank you all so much for your support. Of course, everything that I do at Point North Media is funded through your support on Patreon. Head on over to patreon.com/Point North Media. Pledge $1 a month, whatever you can afford. I'm so thrilled, by the way, that we made it to the end of tonight's session without any interruption to our internet service, any interruption to our electrical service. We did it, you guys. We did it. We faced the Dementors and we won. I'm going to have some of this chocolate. I'm going to have some of this wine, and then I'm going to get to work planning next week's definitely going to be 2-hour session of Dear Mr. Potter. In fact, let me show you that slide so that we can prepare ourselves here. So next week, not just chapters 7 and 8, the boggart in the wardrobe and the flight of the fat lady, but chapters 6, 7, and 8. That is 10 p.m. Eastern. We're holding to our 10 p.m. Eastern time slot for the next couple of weeks. 10 p.m. Eastern, Tuesday, August the 29th. 3 chapters, no waiting. We're going to get through it. It's going to run for 2 hours, but it's going to be a ton of fun. I hope that you will be able to join me for that. That will do it for this week. Thanks so much for being here. I will talk to you all again soon. Find me on Twitter. Find me via email. Come share your thoughts about all things Harry Potter. I can't wait to hear them. Until next time, you guys, good night. Have a safe week. Mischief managed.